Right, Matt, last week's episode, we've never had such a mailbag from it, which could be a good thing in some circumstances.
No, and that's partly because we've never had a guest like Charlie Mullins.
Yeah.
There's only one of them.
Yeah.
And I suppose, should
we have the categories of complaints, and let's be straight about it, it's 99% complaint. Although there were a few people who did write in and say they'd enjoyed listening to him. David Lewis from Rutland, he said, I always enjoy listening to your podcast, but listening to your quotes interview with Charlie Mullins, I couldn't believe how he was indulged. I agree with him on apprenticeships. The rest of it was pure right-wing bullshit. Why is it that people like him think they're the only ones who work hard? No, I'm sorry, guys, you let him off the hook. Where were the challenges from you? James O'Brien would have made mincemeat of him. Sorry to have a moan. I love the paper and the podcasts, but please don't go easy on these people. That was David Lewis. Mick Groombridge wrote, I enjoyed Friday's show, brackets, surprisingly. Although Charlie appears to have a very simplistic view of the world. His views are given space because he's a very rich businessman. I get that. It's the way of the world. In fact, his thoughts on work and apprenticeships made a lot of sense. However, Nigel Farage is our political saviour. Really? Come on, Charlie. Get a grip, man. And then Anne Shilcock represents another tranche of complaints, which all began stuff like this. Why would I listen to the views of a man who, after all the opportunities this country has afforded him, as soon as it looks like he may have to pay more tax, legs it off to Marbella and the millionaire's ghetto of Dubai? This is my first question. My second question is, what on earth were you thinking? So we kind of had three categories of response. One was, you should have challenged Charlie a lot harder. When Charlie Mullins started speaking about Nigel Farage and Lee Anderson, why didn't we call him out on the spot and nail him to the ground on that? The second category was, you should never have had him on, really. You know, I don't want to listen to it. He can be somewhere else. So, you know, we hear enough of this crap on Mail Online. And then the third category was, I listened to it, I liked it, but I don't agree with him, right?
Yeah.
And so, that first category, 100%, that's where we are, really.
Yes, and we said so.
Yeah, and the second category of people, the ones who said, you should never have had him on. Now, I'm sorry, people. I think this is where the bloody problem is.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, here's the thing. People are always saying, and especially, let's be honest, on our side of the tracks, the progressive side of the tracks, always saying that they're against polarisation. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And in favour of listening and looking for the common ground, right? And isn't it awful that there are all these right-wingers who won't talk, right? And then we get one on, and it's you shouldn't have him on.
Yeah.
I mean, and also let's sort of categorise Charlie Mullins as a character, right? He's not Tommy Robinson inciting racial hatred. He's not Andrew Tate speaking horrible misogynistic, spreading horrible misogynistic tropes. He's a self-made millionaire who has left the country, doesn't approve of Labour, was a Remainer, and has gone over to Reform. Now, that's a really interesting type, or it's a very interesting character.
Yeah, almost unique, actually.
Almost unique, but in there, there's lots of bits of story, like someone who can't operate under a Labour government, someone who was a Remainer, but someone who's shifted over to Farage. Now, I'm interested in all three bits. And particularly because, you know, Reform took 14% of the vote after only 4.5 weeks in the election in July. After only 4.5 weeks of Farage really having set as a light. So obviously they're going places, and trying to understand what that coalition is composed of is, I think, a really important part of the progressive challenge. And so I won't apologise for having him on. Now, you know, did we challenge him enough? I mean, look, that is a subjective judgment.
Well, so a lot of people have explicitly said it was just bad interviewing, right? So let me address that. I wasn't interviewing Charlie Mullins. It's not the James O'Brien show.
No, exactly.
It's not a Andrew Neil holding a politician it's not an inquisition. It's a conversation.
Yeah. No.
And this podcast, I hope, I mean, you know, everybody who likes us says, I just enjoy listening to the conversation. Now, I like Charlie Mullins as a person. First time I've ever met him.
Yes.
But I'll tell you, as I said in the interview, he was very supportive of the New European when we started. And if I picked people I chose to spoke to based on whether they align 100% with my thinking, or even 90%, or even 50%, I'd run out of people very quickly. And I actually enjoy talking to, and the bits of that interview I enjoyed talking to Charlie about most were how his background and how he came to be who he was, and the boxing and the way he thinks about apprenticeships and all of this, and the way he thinks about society, and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, I think the point to make here is that in journalism, in podcasting, in the media, there are different categories of discussion. Now, Andrew Neil, who you mentioned, is, to my mind, the best forensic cross-examiner of his subject.
Yeah, because his preparation is
brilliant.
His questioning his line of attack is absolutely pristine.
It's barristerial. It's brilliant.
Like 180 on darts.
James O'Brien, another hero of mine, he's a sort of Socratic thinker.
Yeah.
He says, well, hang on, you said this, so then this, so then this, and it's like being in the philosopher's study, right? And he corners people philosophically, right? Yeah.
But he can make, and the criticism of James often is that he makes a fool of people who aren't up to his intellectual capacity.
Right. But that's what James, that's his gig, right? Now, this is a podcast which, as you say, is openly and has always been conversational.
Yeah.
And I think that there is, talking about that, what we're going to do at polarization, how are we going to find common ground? I do think that letting people talk, rather than just saying, haha, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? Everyone knows where we're coming from. I mean, if you listen to this podcast, you know what we think about, tax evasion, what we think about tax avoidance, what we think about Nigel Farage. None of this is new. And to be honest, I think it would have been a pretty pointless podcast if we'd had Charlie on and said, hang on a minute, Farage is an idiot, or hang on a minute, you're not paying your taxes, or hang on, I mean, what would actually the yield of that?
Zero.
What would the yield of that been, other than to give people a pheromone rush? And this is where I really do think it's important to kind of make a stand, which is the purpose of podcasting, journalism, anything like that, is not to give people a pheromone rush. It's to try and understand what's going on, to try and analyse it, and there are different forms and different ways of doing it. That was one.
Yeah.
Maybe in a different circumstance, it would have been another. But I think that the idea that the only conceivable reason to have someone like Charlie Mullins on the podcast would be to sort of cut him down to size, right? That's not interesting.
And also, it's incredibly disrespectful.
It's disrespectful.
He started out as a plumber, aged at 9, I think.
Right.
He has dragged himself up from real kind of Dickensian poverty, and a terrible background, and he's made this. Now, if that's not fascinating to people,
it is fascinating
to spend 45 minutes in that guy's company.
And the other thing is, I'm afraid, detect underpinning some of the criticism that's been made, not necessarily by these individuals, but generally of the podcast, a slight snobbery, which is, why would I want to listen to this yobbo talking about, his right-wing views? Well, if you want to put it like that, because there are quite a lot of people who think like Charlie.
Yeah.
And if we're going to prevail, rather than just complain, we're going to have to bring people like Charlie with us.
And the other side to it is that I know for a fact. So let me address two things here. Charlie Mullins enjoyed that podcast, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's good as well, because Charlie Mullins came into it quite defensive and thinking, right, okay, all right, I'll answer what you've got, but you've got to let me have my say. And we were like, Charlie, honestly, relax. It's a conversation.
It's a conversation.
Right? It's not going to be an ordeal. And by the end of it, he said, that was brilliant. Thank you. Now, I'll tell you a story about the New European. I was phoned up by Aaron Banks.
Oh, right? yeah.
And Aaron Banks, I think, looking back at it in hindsight, and I hope people will take this in the spirit of forgiveness and compassion that I'm applying to myself, manipulated me. And he said, why don't you let me write a column? And, and I said, all right, because my instinct was, my readers are big enough to be challenged, and they can accommodate that. And we let Banks write a column. Now, we lost loads of subscribers.
Yes.
Overnight. And people said to me, I don't want to see that shit tainting the new European, right?
Purity test.
And I think there is a line that where Aaron Banks, and the other story I was going to tell is that Alistair Campbell, who also you may not know, he has a podcast. He was, he does, a small little political thing with some bloke.
Following, I thought, because Rory Stewart's got a show, I know.
Yeah. No, Alistair's on that occasionally, yeah.
What, like as a sidekick?
Like sort of Eric Wise. Ernie Wise. He's Ernie Wise.
Little Ern, yeah.
Little Ern. And they record it in single beds. Did you know that?
Did they?
Yeah. Anyway, so Alistair...
Enduring image.
Emailed me one day and said, I've asked Nigel Farage to come on the show. Do you think that's a good idea, right? And they've been trying to get Farage onto the
100%.
show. Well, so, okay, I said don't, because the format of the podcast is such that you will be polite and civil. You'll have a nice conversation with him, and you'll end up being accused of giving him a platform. So if Nigel Farage said he wanted to come on our show, I think I'd have to say no. I think because the right platform for you is Andrew Neil, is James O'Brien. It's
an interesting distinction.
I don't want to sit here and have a row with Nigel Farage on my podcast. It's true.
I mean, it's an interesting point, because you're right that Farage would come in all guns blazing,
and he'd try and use us. Now,
yes.
I don't. There's no. Charlie Mullins wasn't trying to use us.
Not the slightest.
He came to it with the same spirit we came to it.
Yes.
Which is all right. Let's have a chat.
On the back, let us never forget of us in the New European having taken the piss out of him.
Taking the piss out of him. And actually, if people want to know the difference between a guy with a big heart, and I think he's got a big heart. He does have a big heart.
No, he does.
And he took the joke. We took the piss out of him in the paper about him leaving the country. And he said, and he said, look, fair play. And he put that story on his social media.
Yeah.
And I said, well, come onto the podcast and let's talk about it. And it was in that spirit. Now, if I invite somebody into my house, I'm not going to start slagging them off if I don't like their political views.
No.
I'm going to try and reach ground with them. And that's what we did.
Let's keep this in perspective, right? This was one podcast.
Yeah.
It didn't indicate a change of direction by the New European or the two Mats or anything like that. But it is the case that we are now at what people insist on calling an inflection point in politics, which is that there is a chance for progressive thinking to challenge the sort of nationalist hegemony that there's been in many, many parts of the world. But that won't happen in a sort of last battle, grand, conflict. I mean, that's dialectical thinking.
Yeah.
It will happen by conversations, slow persuasion, unlikely alliances. Imperfect allies is one of my favourite phrases, imperfect allies. I don't know whether Charlie personally could ever be brought round to our way of thinking. That's not really the point. But what I do think is that if you start off from, I hate the stay in your lane talk. I hate no platforming. I hate this idea that the first thing you do before you have any conversation is establish who can't take part in it. Right? I do it the other way around, which is who do we absolutely have to exclude?
Yeah.
Right? And I don't include Charlie Mullins in that.
And not even close.
And if anyone disagrees, I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. And are we going to now have a stream of reform supporters on the podcast? Obviously not. No. But we may have another one.
And if by the way, if you are listening because you because of the Charlie Mullins interview that you think we are on the Andrew Tate side of life, then you're going to be sorely disappointed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was not that did not indicate a shift of position. Yeah. But also, people, let's not have brittle spirits. Okay,
right.
Let's not have brittle spirits. We can. If you can't take Charlie Mullins, right?
Yeah.
How can you take what's out there?
So here's my rule of thumb on it, right? And I apply this to like all sorts of things, but if you were in a pub and somebody you didn't know said something that you found so objectionable that you felt like you either had to challenge them or walk out of the pub, right? Then that's an odious kind of character, and you don't want to be in that place. Charlie Mullins is not in that category,
I mean, he said things where I thought, well, I don't agree with that, but not where I felt I had to kind of, muster a gotcha moment.
No.
I was much more interested, and I have heard people say that they've heard the pod and said this, the same, which is that he's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
And people are complex. The thing about him that's interesting is that he's got lots of aspects to him.
Yeah.
And you go through each this extraordinary story of self-creation and massive success, born of extraordinary sort of enterprise and obvious generosity of spirit as well, by the way, being a Remainer. And then, I think the bit that's sort of mysterious to us but interesting is why would you go over to Farage? And I think that question for me is one that's going to be worth pursuing journalistically.
Listen, mate, if we don't try and understand that, then we're all screwed.
Well, that's the direction of travel. There are lots and lots, and this is, again, people don't want to hear it, but it's the case. There are a lot of people out there. The Tories are nowhere at the moment, right? They are nowhere. But there are a lot of people, and young people in particular, who are looking at reform and thinking, for all sorts of reasons, that's my kind of party. Now, we have to take the measure of that. And taking the measure of something doesn't just mean shouting at it.
Yeah.
This is the terrible bequest of social media, is the idea that if you yell at someone long enough, they'll go, oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
You're right, after all.
I didn't realise,
right.
If only you'd abused me before,
Yeah. All
so
right.
there you go. No apologies, no regret.
Anne Shilcock, who asked the question, what on earth were you thinking? That's what we were thinking.
That's what we were thinking. And we still think it.
Yeah.
Get that down.